When the mail arrived, I found a stack of aggressive letters from the HOA, demanding thousands in fines for violations tied to my deceased grandparents' old property. The kicker: they'd been dead for years, yet Karen, the HOA's relentless enforcer, kept sending threats, unaware she was breaking federal law. What started as a frustrating mix-up spiraled into a battle exposing corruption, legal violations, and a neighborhood tyrant's downfall. I never thought I'd be dealing with something like this. A few months ago, I was sorting through my mail when I noticed a pile of envelopes from the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. They were addressed to my grandparents, Harold and Margaret Thompson, who had passed away 3 years earlier. At first, I figured it was a clerical error. Maybe the HOA hadn't updated their records. But when I opened the letters, my jaw dropped. They were demanding payment for fines totaling over $7,000 for supposed violations at my grandparents' old house, which they hadn't even lived in since they moved to a nursing home 5 years ago. The letters were signed by someone named Karen Whitaker, the HOA president, and they were written in this aggressive, almost bullying tone, threatening legal action if the fines weren't paid immediately. I was confused. My grandparents' house had been sold 2 years ago after their estate was settled. Why was the HOA still sending them bills? And how could they rack up thousands in fines for a property they no longer owned? I called the HOA office the next day, expecting a simple explanation. Instead, I got Karen herself on the phone, and let me tell you, she was something else. She spoke in this condescending tone, like I was a child who didn't understand how the world worked. When I explained that my grandparents were deceased and no longer owned the property, she didn't even pause. "Well, someone has to pay these fines," she said. "The violations occurred, and the association doesn't care who settles the debt." I was floored. Did she not hear me? My grandparents were dead. They couldn't exactly mow the lawn or fix a fence from beyond the grave. I tried to stay calm and asked for details about the violations. Karen rattled off a list: overgrown grass, an unapproved mailbox, peeling paint on the garage door, and even a non-compliant garden gnome that was apparently too tall. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A garden gnome? And these issues supposedly happened over the past 2 years, long after the house was sold. I told her the property had a new owner, but she cut me off. "That's not our concern," she snapped. "The fines are tied to the Thompsons, and they need to be paid." I asked her to check her records, but she refused, saying it was my responsibility to prove my grandparents no longer owned the house. Then she hung up. I was furious, but figured I'd handle it by sending a letter with proof of the sale and my grandparents' death certificates. I included a polite note explaining the situation and assumed that would be the end of it. A week later, I got another letter from Karen. Not only did she ignore my evidence, but she'd added a $500 late fee to the fines. The letter said, "Failure to comply with HOA regulations will result in a lien on the property and further legal action." A lien? On a house my grandparents didn't own? I couldn't wrap my head around it. That's when I realized this wasn't just a mistake. Karen was deliberately ignoring the facts. I started digging into Willow Creek's HOA rules and reached out to the new owner of the house, a nice guy named Mike who'd bought it through a real estate agent. Mike was just as confused as I was. He said he'd never received any violation notices from the HOA, and his property was in good shape: no overgrown grass, no illegal gnomes. He even sent me photos to prove it. So why was Karen targeting my grandparents? I called the HOA again, but this time, no one answered. I left voicemails and sent emails, but they went ignored. Meanwhile, the letters kept coming, each one more threatening than the last. One even mentioned garnishing my grandparents' wages. Wages? They were retired and deceased. At this point, I was losing sleep over it. I couldn't understand why Karen was so fixated on my grandparents. I started talking to friends about it, and one of them, a paralegal named Sarah, suggested I look into federal laws about debt collection. She mentioned something called the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, or FDCPA, which protects people from harassment by debt collectors. I wasn't sure if it applied to HOAs, but I started researching. That's when I stumbled across a goldmine. The FDCPA explicitly prohibits collectors from trying to collect debts from deceased individuals or their families unless they're legally responsible for the estate. Since my grandparents' estate was settled and the house sold, I wasn't liable for anything. Even better, I found case law showing that HOAs could be considered debt collectors under the FDCPA if they were pursuing fines aggressively. Karen's letters, with their threats and late fees, fit the bill perfectly. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to confront Karen at the next HOA meeting. I found out they were held monthly at the community center, so I showed up, bringing copies of the house sale documents, my grandparents' death certificates, and printouts of the FDCPA. The room was packed with homeowners, and Karen was at the front, holding court like she owned the place. When I got a chance to speak, I laid out the situation: the fines, the threats, the fact that my grandparents were deceased, and how her actions violated federal law. The room went silent. Karen's face turned red, and she tried to interrupt, saying I was disrupting the meeting. But I kept going, reading excerpts from the FDCPA and pointing out that her letters could land the HOA in a lawsuit. To my surprise, other homeowners started speaking up. One woman said she'd been fined for a cracked driveway that was already fixed. A guy in the back complained about a $200 fine for leaving his trash can out an hour too long. It turned out Karen had been sending out fines left and right, often for minor or non-existent violations. People were fed up, but no one had challenged her until now. By the end of the meeting, Karen was visibly shaken. She promised to look into my grandparents' case, but I wasn't holding my breath. The next day, I got a call from a lawyer representing the HOA. He was polite, but clearly trying to smooth things over. He said the fines were a misunderstanding, and offered to waive them if I agreed not to pursue legal action. I wasn't buying it. I told him I'd already consulted an attorney and was considering a lawsuit for FDCPA violations, emotional distress, and harassment. I also mentioned I was looking into whether Karen's actions constituted mail fraud, since she'd sent threatening letters through the U.S. mail knowing they were baseless. That got his attention. He asked for a week to resolve the matter internally. While I waited, I kept digging. I joined a neighborhood Facebook group and posted about my experience, asking if anyone else had issues with Karen. The responses flooded in. Dozens of people shared stories of outrageous fines, rude encounters, and threats from Karen. One couple said they'd been fined $1,000 for planting flowers that weren't on the HOA's approved list. Another guy claimed Karen had tried to foreclose on his home over a $300 fine he disputed. The more I read, the clearer it became. Karen wasn't just overzealous, she was running the HOA like her personal fiefdom. Then I got a tip from a former HOA board member who'd moved away. He said Karen had a history of targeting older residents or people who'd passed away, figuring they wouldn't fight back. He also hinted that the HOA's finances were shady. That got me thinking. I requested financial records from the HOA, which homeowners are legally entitled to under state law. It took some back and forth, but they finally sent me a spreadsheet. It was a mess, but I noticed something odd: thousands of dollars in administrative fees paid to a company called Whitaker Consulting. Guess who owned it? Karen's husband. I was starting to see the bigger picture. Karen wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was profiting off the fines she imposed. The more violations she issued, the more consulting fees her husband's company racked up. I shared my findings with the lawyer I'd consulted, and he said we had a strong case not only for FDCPA violations but also for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. He suggested filing a complaint with the State Attorney General's office and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which I did. A week later, the HOA lawyer called back with a better offer. Not only would they waive all fines against my grandparents, but they'd also reimburse me for legal fees and send a formal apology. In exchange, they wanted me to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I refused. I wasn't going to let Karen off the hook that easily. I told the lawyer I'd only settle if Karen stepped down as president and the HOA agreed to an independent audit of its finances. He said he'd take it to the board, but I could tell they were sweating. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was in full revolt. At the next meeting, dozens of homeowners showed up, many citing my Facebook post. They demanded a vote to remove Karen, and it passed almost unanimously. Karen tried to argue, claiming she'd been misrepresented, but no one was buying it. She stormed out, threatening to sue everyone. A few days later, I heard she'd put her house up for sale. The fallout didn't stop there. The State Attorney General's office opened an investigation into Willow Creek's HOA based on my complaint and others that followed. The audit I'd pushed for uncovered thousands in misallocated funds, including payments to Whitaker Consulting for services that were never documented. Karen and her husband were forced to repay the money, and last I heard, they were facing civil penalties. The HOA elected a new board, and they've since revised their rules to prevent future abuse. Looking back, I'm still amazed at how a stack of misdirected letters turned into a full-blown crusade. I didn't just clear my grandparents' names, I helped take down a corrupt HOA and protect my neighbors from harassment. If I'd ignored those letters, who knows how many more damage Karen could have done. I'm sharing this now because I want others to know their rights. If an HOA is harassing you, especially over baseless fines, don't just pay up. Check the law, document everything, and fight back. You might just uncover something bigger than you ever expected.